The air inside the Peterbilt's cabin was dense and stale, permeated by the persistent scent of old coffee, diesel, and the accumulated dust of thousands of miles. Jorge, a 62-year-old truck driver, his features carved by time and sun, gripped the steering wheel with his calloused hands, feeling the familiar and reassuring tremor of the engine beneath his feet. Only a few hours remained until his much-anticipated retirement, and he was driving along US 26, winding through the heart of Oregon, towards bustling Portland under a sky that, despite being free of heavy clouds, promised impending rain. Suddenly, on the horizon that unfolded before him, the imposing silhouette of the bridge over the Columbia River emerged. A steel behemoth, mighty and robust, stretching across the river's gray waters. But in an instant that seemed to last an eternity, reality shattered before his eyes. The solid metal and concrete structure violently undulated, as if made of jelly. Grotesque and deep cracks erupted on its surface with a guttural sound, a metallic wail that only Jorge could hear, and in the blink of an eye, the bridge collapsed. Dozens of vehicles, silently, like miniature toys, were relentlessly dragged into the murky, dark depths of the river. Inaudible screams of pure terror echoed in George's mind, a glacial and paralyzing chill coursing through every inch of his spine. It wasn't fatigue, nor delirium. It was a premonition, a vivid and terrifying glimpse of an imminent tragedy, a premonition that held him captive. A muffled, hoarse cry escaped George's dry, cracked lips. Cold sweat streamed profusely down his wrinkled forehead, dripping onto his temples, while his wide, bloodshot eyes remained fixed on what had been the bridge in his vision. With a jolt that shook him to his soul, he pulled the colossal Peterbilt onto the shoulder, the air brakes hissing loudly and shrilly, releasing dense vapor that mixed with the cold air, forcing the truck to an abrupt halt a few feet from the toll plaza that preceded the structure. I heard the screams, the metal twisting, and the silent explosions. Old man, are you completely out of your mind? How could he make these people believe in something so absurd, so unreal? He saw their lives hanging by a thin thread, about to snap, and they saw him only as a roadside lunatic. Nevertheless, he would not give up. The premonition was too strong, the sense of responsibility and overwhelming weight on his tired shoulders. He wasn't the hero, just a weary, almost retired man who suddenly found himself with one last terrible job to do. And, ironically, that last job seemed to be saving lives he didn't even know. The air grew even colder and denser, almost palpable, laden with heavy humidity. The smell of rusty metal, which before seemed to come from his vision, now hung in the damp, heavy morning air, a premonitory odor that enveloped him completely. Are you drunk? Get out of the way. I'm in a hurry. I have to catch an important flight in Seattle. His voice was sharp, devoid of patience. Jorge tried to explain, gesturing frantically with his trembling hands, pointing at the imposing structure. The confusion in his mind was a whirlwind of terrifying images and nauseating sensations. He remembered the hollow, frightening thud of the structure breaking apart, a smell of panic and gasoline mingling, almost real, as if he were still trapped in that moment. His heart pounded like an untamed drum in his chest, each beat echoing painfully in his ears, a frantic rhythm of terror. The image of vehicles plunging into the river, the sensation of cold water invading his lungs, and the pungent, nauseating smell of diesel mixed with mud were so vivid he could almost taste death on his tongue. Slowly, as if moving underwater against an invisible resistance, Jorge opened the heavy cabin door. The rusty metallic creak mingled with the distant, irritating sound of impatient horns. The chilly autumn wind of Oregon whipped his face, chilling his skin, but he barely felt the biting breeze. The urgency of the premonition, the weight of the lives he saw being lost, consumed him entirely. He watched the line of cars and trucks approaching, each a potential victim, blind to the abyss that awaited them, to the trap that fate had set. Stop! The bridge is going to collapse. he shouted, his voice hoarse from years on the road, almost a desperate lament, but filled with a new and unwavering conviction that welled up from the deepest part of his being. The drivers in the toll line turned their heads in his direction, some with genuine curiosity, others with patent irritation etched on their hardened faces. A young woman at the toll booth, Sarah, around 23, with vibrant blue hair that contrasted with her sober uniform and a small nose piercing that glinted in the artificial light, looked at him with a mix of skepticism and pity. "Sir, are you all right? The bridge was inspected last week. It's in perfect condition. There's no cause for concern," she said, her voice calm and professional, but with a subtle, almost inaudible hint of impatience. "No, I saw it. I saw it collapse. Hundreds of cars, people. A man in an immaculate suit and designer sunglasses at the wheel of a sleek black SUV lowered the tinted window." Frustration and despair mingled within Jorge, a bitter cocktail of emotions. George's almost fanatical persistence, combined with the strange and unwavering conviction in his eyes, finally broke through Sarah's skeptical facade. Hesitantly, and with an uneasy premonition, she alerted her supervisor. The smell of coffee on his breath contrasted sharply with the damp, metallic smell of the air, almost acrid. He listened to George's confused account of the bridge collapsing, the hundreds of cars, the icy water. He frowned, his gaze fixed on the bridge, as if searching for the cracks the truck driver claimed to have seen. The murmur grew louder, mixing with the driver's grumbling and the sound of the light rain that had begun to fall. Frank, seeing the commotion building and realizing the situation could get out of hand, decided, as a precaution and to calm the agitated spirits, to call the transportation authorities and the police. A few minutes later, the deep, distinct sound of a siren cut through the damp air. He instructed Frank to temporarily close the bridge. The traffic barriers lowered with a dull, heavy thud, and the warning lights flashed intermittently yellow, illuminating the light rain that now fell with greater intensity. Drivers in the line began honking in protest, some openly cursing, others demanding more concrete and immediate explanations. Jorge felt a momentary relief, a heavy sigh escaping his lips, but a twinge of apprehension remained, an ominous foreboding. He had diverted fate, but at what cost? The tension in the air was almost palpable, a mixture of frustration, confusion, and the acrid smell of wet asphalt mixing with the odor of overheated brakes from the stopped cars. The weather, previously just cloudy, had become heavy and oppressive, with dark, threatening clouds hanging over the bridge, as if nature itself reflected the strange and somber interruption of events. And an Oregon State Patrol cruiser approached, with Officer Miller, around 35, at the wheel. Miller, with his serious expression and athletic build, stepped out of the car, his rain jacket shedding water, and listened to Jorge with a mix of professional skepticism and growing curiosity. He observed the bridge, the line of impatient cars, and the old truck driver who, though appearing somewhat eccentric, was genuinely terrified. While they waited for the authority to arrive, Jorge continued to try, with difficulty, to keep the drivers at a distance, his voice already hoarse from shouting. "It's one of the safest structures in the Pacific Northwest, a marvel of modern engineering," Frank said, his voice deep and somewhat impatient. He mentioned the excessive load of his own truck, a heavy Peterbilt, feeling that this was somehow linked to the premonition, as if he were an involuntary catalyst, a harbinger of the approaching doom. Officer Miller, though still inherently skeptical, perceived the intensity and authenticity in the old man's gaze. It seemed more than just fatigue or delirium. Something in his choked voice and the way he trembled seemed to indicate a dark and undeniable truth, a warning that could not be ignored, however irrational. But with a visible trace of compassion in his tired eyes, as if he had dealt with many such cases before. "Please, just a little more patience. It's for your safety," he pleaded, as the anger of the delayed drivers simmered. turning their protests into a deafening chorus of impatient horns and muffled curses. The supervisor, a burly man with a tired countenance named Frank, around 50, with a neatly trimmed gray mustache that hid part of his lips, arrived at the toll plaza with a barely disguised expression of annoyance. "Sir, I understand you're stressed, perhaps even disoriented, but the bridge was inspected last week. Everything's in order." "No, sir, you don't understand," Jorge insisted, his voice choked with emotion, gesturing frantically with trembling hands, pointing at the imposing structure. The image of the collapse flickered in his mind, so real he could feel the river's dampness, and the metallic smell of destruction, as if he were still trapped in that terrifying moment. He turned to the line of cars, which was now more restless and noisy, some drivers getting out of their vehicles to understand the commotion. "You have to believe me. I saw it. The bridge is going to collapse. You're all going to die if you keep going." The escalating argument and George's alarming tone caught the attention of other toll booth employees. "Sir, what exactly did you see?" Miller asked, his voice calm and controlled, but with a note of firmness that demanded a clear answer. Jorge described the vision again, with more vivid details: the sounds of metal twisting, the frightening snaps of the structure breaking, the silent screams of the victims, the overwhelming sense of panic. Miller, following his training in caution and judging the situation as potentially dangerous, decided it was better to err on the side of extreme caution. News of the closure of the I-5 bridge over the Columbia River, with its unexpected interruption of traffic flow, spread like wildfire, creating unprecedented logistical chaos in the Portland metropolitan area and throughout the entire Northwest. Local radio stations and news channels began reporting the unexplained incident, mentioning a mysterious truck driver who claimed to have had a premonition about the structure's collapse. While the hurried transportation engineering team raced to inspect the robust bridge, Jorge waited, his heart still tight and pounding erratically, each beat a vivid reminder of what he had witnessed in his vision. "Sir, we sincerely appreciate your concern." The line of cars, which had accumulated for hours, began to move again, drivers relieved, some still grumbling and complaining loudly about the absurd delay. Jorge watched them pass, a growing sense of dread in his chest, a knot tightening in his throat. He had prevented the tragedy there on the bridge, but the premonition had been so strong, so real, that he couldn't shake the feeling that death, cunning and patient, was just waiting for another moment, another place to claim its harvest. The dread he had felt earlier intensified, making the air in the room heavy and cold despite the heater. The man in the SUV, the first to be saved. The premonition hadn't materialized on the bridge, but death seemed to have found a new route, a winding and dark path to fulfill its design. The smell of burning tires and oil, which he associated with the accident in his premonition, returned to his sense of smell, vivid, almost suffocating him. The air in the motel room seemed to freeze instantly, and the distant sound of a siren, a solitary and chilling lament, cut through the night silence. Was this just the beginning? The smell of tires and hot asphalt returned to the air, mingling with the dampness of the rain, a bittersweet reminder that the danger had not disappeared, only shifted. Your action was prudent, and even though there's no immediate risk, safety is our priority. But it's possible that fatigue is affecting you. Jorge was in a state of semi-consciousness when his cell phone vibrated in his hand. It was a call. It was Sarah, the young woman from the toll booth. Her voice was trembling, almost a whisper, barely audible over the static on the line and the sound of the rain outside. "Mr. Jorge, it's me, Sarah. Do you remember the man in the black SUV who was at the front of the line earlier today? The one who rolled down his window and was rude to you? We consider the bridge safe for traffic." Miller tried to be gentle, but the implication was clear. Jorge was imagining things, his mind playing tricks on him. His car just went off the road on a sharp curve, a few miles from here. Near you is 101. a dangerous downhill section. There were no brake marks. The police said it was as if something had pushed him off the road. "It's terrifying, Mr. Jorge." He observed the bridge from a distance, its imposing and unaltered silhouette seeming to challenge him, as if it held a dark secret within its steel and concrete entrails. He could feel the suspicious gazes of Frank and Officer Miller, even if they weren't looking directly at him, an uncomfortable sensation of being judged. Hours dragged slowly, each minute feeling like a century, intensifying George's agony. The inspections were meticulous, utilizing cutting-edge technology, but revealed no structural flaws, not even the slightest crack or sign of fatigue. The vision was so real, so vivid, so full of terrifying details. He couldn't have been mistaken. But if the bridge was safe, what had he seen? Was it just a delusion from extreme fatigue, the result of years of sleepless nights on the road? A cruel maneuver of fate to toy with his already exhausted mind? No, it can't be. "I know what I saw. I smelled it. I heard the screams," he murmured, more to himself than to Frank, his voice almost inaudible against the sound of the wind and distant voices. The bridge was apparently perfect, an unshakable monument to engineering. Frank, the toll plaza supervisor, approached her, his expression a complex mixture of relief that there were no problems and exasperation over the unnecessary interruption. "Sir, we found nothing. The bridge is safe. We'll have to reopen it soon. The pressure from authorities is immense," he said, his voice thick with tiredness and frustration. Jorge felt an icy chill that ran through his entire body, as if a ghost had touched him. Officer Miller, who was observing the scene from nearby with a more thoughtful expression now, intervened, his voice a little softer and more empathetic. The bridge was reopened with a dry, mechanical signal. That night, while trying to sleep in a roadside motel on US 30, near Astoria, Oregon, sleep was an unattainable luxury. Jorge nodded, his throat dry, even though he knew she couldn't see him. "I remember him perfectly. He had a horrible accident a few hours after crossing the bridge." An icy chill ran through George's spine, from the nape of his neck to his feet, raising the hairs on his arms. Sarah's call reverberated in George's mind for the following days, a gloomy melody of apprehension that wouldn't cease, playing a symphony of fear and guilt. He continued his route, fulfilling the last scheduled deliveries before his much-anticipated retirement, his truck advancing along I-5, cutting through southern Washington. But every mile his Peterbilt covered seemed to draw him deeper into a waking nightmare, without end. To the authorities' eyes, they were just isolated accidents, perhaps tragic and regrettable coincidences. But for Jorge, it was a chain of events orchestrated by something that defied human comprehension, a shadowy entity. The nights were the worst. He barely slept, haunted by visions of the accidents, the distant sound of metal twisting, the crunch of bones, an invitation to the abyss, to the final encounter with the entity that pursued him. The one who had glimpsed death now found himself hunted by it, a shadow lengthening over his already exhausted soul, and over the lives of those he had tried to protect, unaware of the consequences. He knew that his last journey, the path to retirement, was becoming the most dangerous of all, an inevitable reckoning with the fate he had tried to defy. And the smell of burning rubber seemed to follow him into his dreams, transforming them into vivid and repetitive nightmares. Every time he saw a tow truck on his shoulder, or the glint of a police siren in the distance, a shiver ran through his body. Local news reports, which had previously only spoken of the bridge closure, now began to report a series of inexplicable accidents on the winding roads of the Pacific Northwest. And wary, Jorge saw a breaking news report on the station's television, broadcast at a low, distorted volume. A woman identified as Eleanor Vance, a retired teacher who had been in a small red car in the bridge line, had suffered a fatal accident on a winding coastal road, the famous Highway 101, near picturesque Cannon Beach. Her car had plunged off a cliff, aerial images showing the twisted vehicle amidst the jagged coastal rocks. Jorge recognized the model, the color, the details. It was her, another victim. Isolated accidents, seemingly unconnected, but which, under George's gaze, shared a strange. The smell of salty breeze and the distant sound of waves crashing against the rocks on the television seemed to blend. Almost surreal, with the smell of gasoline and the monotonous hum of the convenience store's refrigerator. It was as if death was approaching, step by step, and he, the involuntary savior, was now the bearer of the curse, the conductor of a tragedy that could not be averted. He tried to call Sarah again, his only connection to what seemed real, but her phone was off, out of service. A new wave of panic hit him, overwhelming. She had also been at the toll plaza. Would she be next? The idea was unbearable. And disturbing pattern. All involved drivers who had been stopped at the Columbia River Bridge toll plaza on that fateful day. A young family, traveling in a green minivan towards I-90, near the Cascade Mountains, just hours after crossing the bridge, had their vehicle inexplicably overturned on a monotonous and desolate straightaway, without any apparent obstacle or brake marks. Days later, an elderly couple in a silver sedan, who were also in line, suffered a head-on collision with a truck that appeared out of nowhere on a little-used rural road, somewhere near Spokane, eastern Washington. In every report, the sensation was the same, an invisible and relentless force seemed to push the vehicles towards doom, leaving no traces, no logical explanation, or reliable witnesses. Jorge, his mind churning, began to draw a macabre mental map, connecting the tenuous points between the accidents. He remembered every car, every face in the toll line, their features etched in his memory. The premonition on the bridge had not materialized as expected, but death, cunning and patient, seemed to have changed tactics, hunting, one by one, those he had inadvertently saved. The feeling of guilt oppressed him, a constant, heavy knot in his stomach, turning his meager appetite into nausea. He had tried to cheat fate, and now fate seemed to be collecting its price, not directly from him, but from those who had crossed his path and were, unknowingly, touched by his premonition. He tried to contact Officer Miller, sending messages every few hours and calling incessantly, but his calls went unanswered and his messages remained unread. One day, while stopping at a gas station on US 97 in Bend, Oregon, to refuel his truck, exhausted, the reporter's voice described the location as mysterious, with no witnesses, no brake marks, no logical explanation for the vehicle having left the road. The road became a labyrinth of invisible dangers. Every shadow cast, every sharp curve, every strange sound that came from outside the truck seemed to hide a trap. George's paranoia deepened with each reported accident, spiraling into a downward trajectory of guilt, terror, and mental exhaustion. He felt like an impotent spectator of a macabre parade, each new piece of news a harsh, painful blow to his already fragile sanity. Fate, he realized with chilling clarity, had not been cheated. It had been rewritten in an even crueler and more relentless way. The bridge had merely been a temporary stage, and the play, death, continued, with a cast of victims he had, ironically and unintentionally, saved. He tried to stay connected with Sarah, his only ally in that madness, sending text messages every few hours and calling incessantly. Fate had not forgotten him, and it pursued him relentlessly. He returned to his truck, the cabin cold and dark, feeling the weight of the emptiness he had left behind and the chilling uncertainty of what was to come. He started the engine, its roar filling the air with a taciturn and inexorable promise. The eastbound route was abandoned. He would go west, towards the Pacific, back to where it all began, back to the bridge that should no longer exist, but which awaited him like an old executioner. The retirement he had so longed for, the tranquil mornings of fishing on the lake, now seemed like a distant and cruel mirage, a promise that would never be fulfilled. He had one last act to perform, a final reckoning with the shadow that pursued him. With the fate he had, in his ignorance, tried to defy, he needed to go back to the bridge. Sarah. Panic engulfed him in an overwhelming wave, making him sway. He felt weak. The taste of coffee turned to rust in his mouth. The room seemed to spin around him. It had been him. He had, in some inexplicable way, brought death into that innocent girl's life. The premonition, which had once been a warning of tragedy, now seemed to have been a cruel trap, a call that would make him an instrument of an even darker fate, an involuntary reaper. The sound of the rain intensified, beating like hammers on his skull, and the fresh, bitter smell of wet earth and cut grass invaded the diner, like a foreboding of something dark and inevitable approaching. But her phone remained inactive, the dry, impersonal voicemail tone sounding like a death knell. Instead of heading straight home to his quiet hometown in the mountainous interior of Idaho, he veered east away from the coast, trying to outrun the shadow that seemed to follow his every mile. He drove for hours on end without a specific destination, the landscapes changing dramatically from the dense, humid forests of Oregon to the open, windswept fields of Idaho under a sky that seemed increasingly oppressive, gray and heavy, like a ceiling about to collapse at any moment. The temperature dropped sharply, and the fine rain that incessantly beat against the windshield seemed like the ceaseless weeping of fate, a melancholic lament that accompanied him invading the cabin. The silence was deafening, more terrifying than any accident report. Had she also been reached by the shadow? The idea tormented him relentlessly, gnawing at him from within. She was so young, so full of life, and now, the void, the unknown. Jorge, his mind in tatters, decided to drastically change his route. One night, exhausted and aching, he stopped at a small diner in an isolated village in the middle of nowhere, in Wyoming, near US 26, the only light for miles around. The place was almost deserted, only the strong smell of coffee, the monotonous sizzle of a griddle, and the flickering, yellowed light of the neon signs which pulsed erratically. As he drank his bitter coffee, trying to ward off the fatigue that weighed heavily on his eyes, his gaze fell upon a local newspaper, folded and forgotten on a counter. The headline was small, discreet, but the name emblazoned there instantly chilled his blood and made the coffee, previously hot, taste like cold water in his mouth. Toll booth employee disappears after series of mysterious accidents. Sarah's photo, innocently smiling with her vibrant blue hair, was just below. The article mentioned the recent accidents and the theory of a strange pattern that puzzled local authorities, unable to find an explanation. George's heart pounded painfully, an uncontrolled drum in his throat. He knew he couldn't run anymore. With a grim determination, a cold flame in his chest, Jorge left the diner, the sharp squeal of the door echoing in the night silence, a solitary and melancholic sound.